the feud that formed the New York City skyline. The New York City skyline is one of the most breathtaking views in the world. But did you know that two of the most notable parts of the skyline were actually the result of an ego-filled feud between two former good friends? William Van Alen was the architect responsible for the Chrysler building. He spent 2 years designing the structure at 42nd Street, but it was actually supposed to be done months sooner. Van Alen's goal was to build the tallest building in the world. But he wasn't the only one with that mission in mind. Another architect was trying to break the record himself. His name was H. Craig Severance, and he was tasked with building a tower for the Manhattan Company at 40 Wall Street. The two buildings were just 4 miles apart. Here's everything that built up to the feud. It started in the early 1920s when H. Craig Severance and William Van Alen were partners at their own architecture firm called Severance and Van Alen Architects. The two worked closely, dividing up their duties. Severance handled the sales end of things, while Van Alen was the designer. Together, they built iconic structures, including the Vogar Building on 57th Street and the Bar Building on 44th Street. But 10 years into their partnership, the two best friends began butting heads. They were disagreeing about a lot, and their differences even cost them a few job opportunities. Resentment grew to a point where Van Alen eventually walked away from the firm in 1924. A few years later, Van Alen was enlisted by Walter Chrysler to create an iconic structure, what we now know as the Chrysler Building. Chrysler wanted it to be something different, something giant and record-breaking, something that would make a statement. Together, they settled on a 67-story, 809-foot skyscraper that could fit 11,000 people. In Van Alen's sketch, he drew patterns depicting cars moving across the walls and massive gargoyles shaped like the radiator caps of a Chrysler vehicle, which would spread their wings at each corner of the building. On the top, 6 overlapping steel arches would rise above each side of the tower to form a large dome. One of Van Alen's friends actually said the idea for these arches came from a bottle of Bacardi. Shortly after, Van Alen began his work on the building. Meanwhile, his design was released to the public in 1929. And it caught the attention of his former friend, Severance. At the time, Severance was keeping busy himself. He was working on the tower for the Manhattan Company at 40 Wall Street. One of the Manhattan Company building's investors insisted this should be the world's tallest building. Catching the theme here? The height for the Manhattan Company's tower was projected to be 809 feet tall, which happened to be exactly the same height as the Chrysler building. But there was one issue. Building tall is expensive. So to cut down on labor costs, the Manhattan Company wanted the tower completed in just 1 year. And this wasn't exactly feasible. Other skyscrapers, all of which were smaller than the Manhattan Company building, took 2 years to construct. Not to be deterred, Severance got to work. His building's rendering was similar to Van Alen's. It included 67 stories. But this design also featured a copper pyramid and a mast at the summit, which brought it 48 feet higher than the Chrysler building. News reports spread like wildfire that Severance was going to be responsible for the tallest building in the world. Chrysler immediately met with Van Alen to figure something out. They couldn't bear the thought of losing their chance at a world record. So Van Alen scrambled to draft up a plan to add hundreds of feet to the building. And this time around, every change in the design was carefully kept under wraps. Even the building's workers didn't know the full details. They couldn't risk Severance finding out about their new plan. Van Alen eventually got the green light to make his skyscraper not just the tallest building in the world, but also the tallest man-made structure anyone had ever seen. Yep, that includes the 984-foot-tall Eiffel Tower. He drew and redrew the tower, which, by the way, construction had already started on and was already taking shape. The design jumped from 67 floors to 77 floors. The 6 arches increased to 7. And to top it all off, a giant spire would grow out of the dome to scrape the sky and pierce the clouds. The spire was top secret. Since it had to be hidden from the public, and especially Severance, it needed to be assembled inside the building before being lifted up and out of the tower. Van Alen enlisted his cousin, who was an engineer, to do the math and confirm the addition was doable. So his cousin did say it was possible, but he never said raising a 27-ton steel spire 860 feet above the earth wouldn't be dangerous. They did it anyway. In the 1920s, safety measures were lacking, to say the least. When it came to the Chrysler building, workers didn't even wear hard hats. Add to that, working in frigid, wet temperatures, and there were no fences or boundaries to prevent workers from falling. The Manhattan Company building's working conditions were equally dangerous, if not worse. Everything was so rushed to meet the 1-year deadline, and construction was running around the clock. Of course, as most secrets tend to do, rumors started to leak about Van Alen's plan. Severance caught wind of the fact that the Chrysler building would actually be much higher than originally reported, but he didn't exactly know how much taller it would be. So, Severance and his architect returned to the drafting board. They determined the foundations were strong enough to hold more height and more weight. They weren't ready to lose this battle. They drafted up 5 more stories to bring their building up to 900 feet. Severance was sure this would be tall enough. He couldn't imagine the Chrysler building would be any taller than 900 feet. At the time, construction had reached the 45th floor, and Severance figured it would be impossible for Van Alen to make any other major changes from that point. Press started to catch wind of the race between the Chrysler and the Manhattan Company buildings. Which would rise faster? Which would rise higher? Chrysler finally made an announcement about his building's projected height. He claimed it would be somewhere between 840 and 850 feet. This was just to throw off his competition. Rumors circulated that the building might feature an additional 60-foot flagpole, so Severance added his own flagpole to make his building reach 925 feet. It seemed like the Manhattan Company's building was going to win this. Soon after, it became time to top the Chrysler building with its iconic Spire. Workers slowly began to understand what was happening as they assembled the pieces and realized the product was a 185-foot tall, 27-ton metal lattice. The next step was to raise it to the building's highest arch and rivet it into place. Van Alen stood nearby, watching as his vision slowly came together. Thoughts that ran through his head were, what if the cables lowering it break and all 54,000 pounds fall through the building? What if the crane can't even lift that needle high enough? What if the wind kicks in and tips the spire over the edge of the building? That would cause it to fall down over 70 stories, crashing onto the streets below. But in just 90 minutes, the job was completed. The lattice stood sturdy at a whopping 1,046 feet. Still, Chrysler didn't make any official announcements on the building's height. The Manhattan Company building finished shortly after and secured its place as the second tallest building in the world. Severance just didn't know it yet. 1 month after the buildings were done, news finally broke that the Chrysler Corporation and Van Alen won the skyscraper race. A trade publication called the Daily Building Report was the first to report the news. Severance was in disbelief, but the final measurements were in. The Chrysler building stood at 1,046 feet tall. The Manhattan Company building reached just 927 feet. This competition single-handedly fueled 2 of the most outstanding features in New York City's skyline as we know it today. To date, the tallest building in New York City is the Freedom Tower at One World Trade Center. It stands 1,776 feet tall. The tallest building in the world is Burj Khalifa in Dubai, which stands at a remarkable 2,722 feet, a height that Severance and Van Alen only could have dreamed of.